I rise in strong support of this legislation, my bill, H.R. 3089, the NDO Fairness Act. This bill makes much-needed changes to the way law enforcement obtains and utilizes non-disclosure orders, also known as secrecy orders. Before modern advancements in cloud computing, when a law enforcement officer wanted to search someone's office, they would be required to obtain a search warrant based on probable cause, as we're all well aware of. When the officer executed the search, they would notify the individual, who would then have an opportunity to challenge the search in court. However, the era of cloud computing has ushered in a new method of storing sensitive information, whereby, as we know, individuals are replacing file cabinets with the digital file folders. To them, by surrendering this physical office in favor of a digital office, individuals are also surrendering their expectation of privacy. That's because a provision within the Electronic Communications Privacy Act allows law enforcement to access an individual's data by subpoenaing the third-party service provider, such as Microsoft, Google, Apple, rather than the individual. The law enforcement officer then imposes a secrecy order on the company, preventing them from notifying the individual of the search. The secrecy order is then often boilerplate in nature and without a time limit, leading to abuse and overuse. According to Microsoft, between January to June 2022, federal authorities requested U.S. citizen data for more than 5,500 accounts, on average of 15 requests per day. Over the same time period, Google received more than 21,000 subpoenas for nearly 50,000 accounts. Apple, whose public data is only available through calendar year 2021, received more than 6,600 requests between July and December of that year. In nearly all the cases, a secrecy order was imposed on the company to prevent the disclosure of the search. The NDO Fairness Act would stop this abuse, which has allowed the circumvention of the Fourth Amendment protections in favor of simple convenience. This legislation ends indefinite secrecy orders and instead requiring the court to certify that disclosing the search is likely to jeopardize an investigation or result in a destructive, oftentimes full elimination of evidence, or endanger the life of an individual. This legislation also imposes a 90-day limit on secrecy orders, with an extension available if and only if the need for secrecy is justified based on the facts and approval by a judge. Finally, this legislation gives the individual subject to search a chance to be heard, and a chance to request a copy of the information that was disclosed. Today's legislation, while not a major overhaul of ECPA, provides us with an opportunity to address the threat to our constitutional freedoms. These changes, I believe, will bring searches of the cloud more closely in line with the Fourth Amendment searches. I want to thank my colleagues from New York, the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler, for co-leading this bill, and I want to thank the chairman of the committee, Chairman Jordan, for his leadership on the issue. I urge swift passage of the bill and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, messages from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed to Senate Joint Resolution 23, a resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8, Title 5, United States Code of the rules submitted by the National Marine Fisheries Service relating to endangered and threatened wildlife and plants, regulation for listing endangered and threatened species and designated critical habitat, in which concurrence of the House is requested.
The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I thank the Speaker. As to use such time as I might consume.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Let me first of all indicate that today is the National Fraternal Order of Police 42nd Annual National Peace Officers Memorial Service, which I will make comments on throughout my discussion and debate of other bills. But it is important to note the hundreds and hundreds of police officers that are here to honor those who have fallen in the line of duty, and the many, many families who are here as well, mourning and receiving recognition today. At the same time, I want to render my sympathy and concern for Congressman Jerry Conley and 2 staff members that have been violently attacked in his congressional office in Virginia, and to indicate our prayers and best wishes in particular for these particular staff person's speedy recovery. I know that we all are stunned, but also offer our concern to our colleague and wishing him safety along with those of his staff. I now rise, Mr. Speaker, to offer strong support for H.R. 3089, the Non-Disclosure Order Fairness Act, crucial bipartisan surveillance reform legislation that passed out of the Judiciary Committee last week on a voice vote. I thank Mr. Fitzgerald and I thank Mr. Nadler, the ranking member, for his leadership, working together with Mr. Fitzgerald, and of course all of us on the committee that saw the rightness and reason for this legislation. The NDO Fairness Act is a simple, straightforward bill that addresses a narrow problem by establishing essential guardrails for when the government seeks to assess someone's electronic communications without that person's knowledge. This legislation would insert balance into a system that for too long has been a free-for-all for government prosecutors. Let me be very clear. Nothing that we are doing is intending to undermine the fair prosecution of those who have done wrong, those who are criminal and otherwise, and who warrant the prosecution of the federal government. But it is, as we debated right after 9/11, it is an attempt to uphold the values of this nation. I remember the intense discussions we had on the Patriot Act, when the inclination was, after the heinous, devastating murder of 3,000 plus Americans on 9/11, that we needed to do everything to insist that no one had even an inch of freedom. I am glad that in the Judiciary Committee, of which I was a member at that time, we saw the rhyme and the reason, and we worked in a bipartisan way to establish a Patriot Act that could, in fact, fight terrorism, as it has done, but also protect the constitutional rights of Americans. I see this in this NDO Fairness Act today. Under current law, after the government obtains a court's permission to search the contents of a person's electronic communications, of which they would not know, prosecutors must then compel the email service provider to produce the relevant data. To avoid having the service provider turn around and tell its customer about the search, the government can also ask the court to grant a non-disclosure order, or NDO, colloquially referred to as secrecy or gag order. You're gagging the American citizen. There is no time limit for these orders. There's no standard to meet. Today, all the government needs to do is cite one of 5 potential adverse results without showing that it is necessary, and the court may grant the request. Prosecutors frequently seek these secrecy orders in cases where there is clearly sometimes no need, and in situations where the government alone benefits, and in many instances, there is no need. Unlike when a physical search order occurs and a person has the right to go to court to dispute the warrant, NDOs can keep the subject of the search in the dark until the court reverses the order. The NDO Fairness Act would do away with the rubber stamp process that governs gag order requests by ensuring that courts apply a strict scrutiny standard to government requests with a written determination explaining their reasoning. By time-limiting non-disclosure orders, raising the standard of review, and ensuring that service providers have standing when they object, H.R. 3089 inserts transparency, reason, and balance into a system and fairness and justice on both sides that far too long has been a free-for-all for government prosecutors simply by virtue of it being just too easy to overuse. In the 21st century, federal prosecutors no longer need to show up to your office. They just need to raid your virtual office. But unlike physical searches, they can search an email in secret. Our surveillance laws have not kept pace with rapidly changing technology. And, Mr. Speaker, just wait on the march of AI. And so I think this bill is extremely timely because we have to be engaged with our constitutional values no matter what the level of technology is. It is imperative that the House of Representatives act to ensure that Americans are still protected as everyday life moves increasingly online. I thank Congressman Fitzgerald for introducing this bill and Ranking Member Nadler again for his leadership on this issue. I also want to thank Chairman Jordan for moving this bill swiftly through the Judiciary Committee and Senator Lee for his leadership in the Senate. And I was glad to serve as a ranking member of the subcommittee and dealing with this bill as well. So I encourage my colleagues to vote yes and to pass this important legislation today, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we also would reserve unless there are any final comments, and we have no other speakers today, so we are prepared to close whenever.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
As the gentleman is prepared to close, I'm prepared to close at this time. Thank you. Let me cite an example, Mr. Speaker, that I think is worthy of my colleagues' hearing. Between 2016 and 2021, Microsoft received between 7 and 10 NDOs every day. That's on average somewhere from 2,400 to 3,500 secrecy orders a year. Apple has received roughly 13,200 requests with secrecy orders from federal agencies over the past 5 years, which is approximately 2,600 requests annually, or the equivalent of 7 to 8 requests per day that are accompanied by a gag order. Just think of how many Americans that impacts. And they're not the only service providers to feel the legal burden. Google is under about 130,000 secrecy orders right now. Meta averages more than 100,000 requests per year. For example, in the first half of 2021, 70% of the 63,657 search requests Meta received included gag orders. That's an enormous tally. That is a lot of Americans. And I want to be very clear as I conclude my remarks. This is in no way attempted to thwart the important prosecution of individuals who are intending to do harm in any way to the United States by way of criminal acts. Certainly we believe in justice in any person who is accused. They have a right to due process, a trial by their peers and otherwise. But we do believe that it is important to protect the vast number of Americans who would not know what is happening to their online searches or their online privacy. And so, Mr. Speaker, the NDO Fairness Act would insert process and deliberation into gag order requests and make it more likely that Americans whose electronic communications are searched can assert their rights in court. This is good bipartisan legislation, and I urge all of my members to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from Texas yields. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to reiterate my strong support for this bipartisan bill, H.R. 3089, which will provide much-needed safeguards on the secrecy order process. I would hope that all my colleagues would support it, and I urge its passage and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman